Brought to you by Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Sulky Threads. Express yourself with Sulky and create with confidence. Our exclusive fabric partners. Be sure to look for their newest lines of fabric.
Hi, I'm June Dudley with Quiltmaker magazine, and this is Quiltmaker's Block Network. Today we have a special guest in the studio. Eric Drexler is the National Educator for Sulky of America. Eric, why don't you tell us what you're planning to demonstrate today?
We're going to do a little bit of blanket stitching on your sewing machine and also some hand embroidery with a little thicker thread to enhance it some.
That's great, and Eric's going to be doing this with Be Inspired, which is block number 318 from Quiltmaker's 100 Blocks Volume 4. Be Inspired is a block designed by Mary Beth Schmidt. To make this block you need a cream background. You need assorted prints for the beehive and for the flowers and stems. You can see the fabric requirements on the side of your screen. If you need to write those down, you can pause your video.
Now that all the fabric has been adhered down to the material with your fusible, we are going to do it with a blanket stitch around the outside. The blanket stitches will hold the edge of the material and keep it from fraying back, and it also gives it a very nice accent around the outside. This is done with a 30-weight thread. Sometimes you can do this with a coordinating color like the browns or the greens, since it is available in 134 colors. You can also get that to match the actual flower color instead of standing out. But I like the contrast with that. Also, we have the bee up here. This is all sewing machine done. This is going to be hand stitched, the embroidery around the outside of the bee there. And I took the pattern from the book and I actually copied this onto a water-soluble stabilizer and laid this over the top of the bee, and I'll show you how to do that next. I took the pattern that is provided to you and I actually put it onto my scanner, bed scanner, and I printed this onto the sticky Fabri-Solvi so that when I get done I can just peel the release sheet off and stick that right onto my material. And I'll show you that next on my next board. Now you can see on this piece I've already cut out the actual bee pattern, and I wanted the bee to go over the top of this bee here. Now I have altered the pattern just a little bit. I didn't draw my bee on here, which is what the directions tell you. I actually made mine out of an applique, and there's a stem stitch that's stitched all the way around the outside of that. That is a hand sewing stitch. When I get done with the bee applique and I've stitched around it, I can actually just lay this back down over the top of there, and it lines up my little bee pathway that it took coming into the beehive. So this is a water-soluble stabilizer that we've printed on with our computer printer. Again, remember to use a low ink setting or your draft setting. That will give you a very light image so that this still won't transfer onto your material when you wash it out. So now you can see that after I've stitched through this, all I have to do is throw it in the washing machine and all of my pattern and my design will go away. It's a really great way of giving you a little bit of a handicap for doing this if you're a beginner, because it will show you precisely where to put your needle in and where to take your needle out. And we'll show you how to do that when I get to the hand sewing part. But let's go do some blanket stitching on the sewing machine. Okay, now I have the machine set up for the blanket stitching. I always check my machine to make sure I'm not still in free motion and have my feed dogs down, because I do switch back and forth all the time. We have our feed dogs up, we have our applique foot on, so this is very open and easy to see where I'm going to be stitching. I've selected the blanket stitch and kind of a narrow stitch width. This is a 4mm stitch width. We don't want to overpower it with a 9mm stitch. A nice fine one is okay. Now I am going to set it on needle down, but I'm just going to push needle down and needle up to bring up that bobbin thread. Again, I always do that just so it doesn't show from the back where this might be trailing across the thread. If it came across over here, I'd be sewing it into the design. So I always try to make sure I bring that bottom thread up. If you have a stay stitching stitch on your machine, lock that stitch in. I'm not going to bother with that for time's sake. But we're going to stitch on the material, but this line right here, we're going to sew off the edge of the material. So that stays right on the border of the material while we're stitching. And then the blanket stitch part of it jumps over the top of the stitch. Now I'm just about to take a stitch in there, and this is why it's a good idea to leave your needle down. You want to pivot just a little bit in the turns, and you don't want to do that while you're sewing. Some tight turns like that might make it look a little off. So there it jumps over, continues stitching straight, and when it jumps over, now here my needle down, I'm going to lift this just a little bit, pivot a little bit more. That'll just keep that stitch nice and straight while I'm sewing around here. Jumping over, back down to needle down again. Turn and pivot your material. Turn and pivot your material. Then you, whoops, boy, it just took right off. Needle down, turn and pivot your material again. So now you can go fast. I like to go slow around the turns. You can turn your stitch length down very close together or have it nice and spread out like I had on this side over here. But for this case, I can go a little bit faster now and finish this line of sewing up. Again, you can shorten these down if you don't want that stitch so far apart. I wanted to show you two different ways, close together and a little bit further apart, your choice. I'm going to talk about the hand embroidery in just a moment, but I did forget to tell you about what weight thread we were using on our blanket stitch on the beehive. The beehive was a 30 weight thread. We don't want a really heavy weight thread because that kind of overpowers the blanket stitch. On this hand embroidery that we have here, I definitely want a thicker thread. Now, this thread that I'm using now is a 12 weight. It's a solid color cotton that we have from Sulky. It comes in a lot of blendable colors also. 126 blendable colors, but for right now for this stitch we're just using the black. Now we've had it in a 330 yard size, or Sulky had it in 330 yard size, but that's a lot for a hand sewer to use. So they have introduced the new petite size, which is very economical and you don't have to have a lot of thread of one color. So these are only 50 yard spools available in a lot of different colors and some of the blendable colors also. But the people that are doing red work and doing these hand embroidery stitches love the petites because you don't have to separate out your floss. One strand of Sulky 12 weight equals 2 strands of floss if you had to separate that out. And it's very nice because it's on a convenient spool that snaps open and closed and keeps your thread nice and tight and trim inside of there. So you pull off how much thread you need, trim it off, wind this back on the spool and trap the end of it. Your color stays on there, your end of the spool stays on there. So that makes it very convenient and is a real time saver too when you start sewing. Now again, I did put my design on sticky back Fabri-Solvi, so this design is actually stuck down to the material. I put it down over the top of the bee and I'm going to stitch this pattern here. Now I've done a few stitches around here just so you could have something to visualize. But I'm going to do a few stitches here. Now I'm a beginner at hand sewing and I'm not real good at it, but I tell you, anything that has a pattern will make your job a whole lot easier. I've taken one stitch through here and I can pull that thread taut, but I can actually see where to put the thread in, where to put the needle in, and you call this rocking. You just rock the material back and you know where to take the needle out. So this is very easy to see how to get an absolutely perfect looking stitch and a perfect length stitch. So each time we do this, we're going to poke the needle in to where that last stitch is and out to where the next one is going to be. And you can always just back it off a little bit if you've taken off too big of a bite in that little rocking stitch that you do. So just pull that nice and tight, not too tight. You want to relax your stitches down when you get finished and start again right after that stitch line and just before your next stitch line. So you just kind of pull the needle back if you've gone in too far and rock that needle into it. After you push that thing through, just cinch that thread up tight. Then you get a nice little stitch all the way around that looks nice and uniformed all the way. So you just finish that off and go around the outside of the bee. Again, the bee was done with a stem stitch and appliqued down with that stem stitch all the way around the whole thing, so that gives it a nice little accent too. Some people prefer a little bit thicker. If you double this over, you get a very, very thick stitch. But I like that single strand that's equal to 2 strands of the floss, and it really works in very, very nicely.
And here's your finished block. Be inspired. Thank you so much, Eric. That was very helpful information about Sulky threads.
It's my pleasure, June.
And thank you for joining us here on Quiltmaker's Block Network. You can find Be Inspired and 99 other fantastic blocks in Quiltmaker's 100 Blocks Volume 4. See you again soon on Quiltmaker's Block Network.
We held that off till we got done. Way to go.